So I'm going to start out talking about herders' experience and observations of climate change. And these first data will be from a series of 120 interviews that we did just this past summer along a precipitation gradient from the forest steppe in the north, the steppe in the middle, and the desert steppe in the south. And this builds on a pilot study that Retta Brugger presented on Monday this week, where we asked questions of herders, a series of closed-ended questions, and then a couple of open-ended questions at the end. And I'm just going to present a few highlights from this, and also compare them with some of the work that Jay Anger is doing with meteorological and remote sensing data. So one of the first questions we asked herders was how rainfall amounts had changed in the past 20 years, so between 1993 and 2013, across these different, there were 6 communities in 3 ecological zones, and you can see that pretty consistently they all perceive, or the vast majority perceive, that rainfall amounts in the past 20 years have decreased a little or a lot, and only in one community in the forest steppe did people perceive less, either no change or there were a few places where they perceived some increases. And this was largely borne out by the 5-year moving average annual rainfall by ecological zone. This is interpolated data from the World Climate data set that Jay analyzed. So according to that data set, there have been significant decreases in the amount of rainfall across all those zones. Another thing we asked was how often does it rain? So what's the amount of time between rainfall events? And again here, there were, the observations were that the time between rainfall events was much longer, and herders on the drier end of that gradient seemed to perceive that to a greater extent than herders in the wetter end of the gradient. And interestingly, the meteorological data found that there were significant increases in the days without rain in the more mesic and so the forest steppe, and then the steppe end of the gradient, and actually no change in the desert steppe. That may be accounted for by increased variability in the rainfall, and that's something else we're looking at now. In terms of then, how do those changes in precipitation and other climate variables that I didn't talk about here affect rangeland conditions and productivity? So I'll just talk about very few results here. One was, how do herders perceive changes in the pasture growth or production in the past 20 years? And again, overwhelmingly, everyone is perceiving that it has decreased somewhat and really has decreased a lot in some areas. Based on this is sort of the remote sensing NDVI data, however, we didn't see that consistent a pattern in those particular areas. We did see significant declines in the steppe zone, but we actually saw an increase in the mountain steppe area or forest steppe, and no change in the desert steppe. And then another thing we asked about was the date of the brown down, so which relates to the length of the growing season. And herders were perceiving this by and large to be earlier or much earlier. And there was variability among the sites, but at least at some of the sites, particularly this one in the steppe zone, there was a pretty significant downward trend that corresponded with their observations. So we then asked, well, what do these changes mean to you? And these were more open-ended questions, and I'll just give you a sample of some of the responses that we got. And herders very clearly understand their dependence on their livestock for their livelihoods, and in turn, the dependence of the livestock on the rangeland resource and how that's related to weather and climate. So herders' life depends on the nature and weather. Any bad change will impact our life. It will cause a loss of quality of wool, cashmere, and meat. If income is lower, our life will worsen because of our dependence on livestock. If there are no grasses, livestock will suffer due to the harsh weather and die. If there is no livestock, we have no food, and we may have to do illegal mining to survive, so change livelihood strategies. poor pasture will cause a poor life. Because we are not educated, we cannot find a job in town. So there's some real limitations on people's ability to change their strategies. One thing I forgot to do, I'm going to interrupt the flow slightly and ask Batishik to hold up a copy of our book. Do you have that there? Or you pass them around? Okay, oh great. So we have copies of this book. We probably have almost enough for everyone, maybe not. And I wanted to say that the photographs in this presentation are mostly photographs taken by herders, and so all the photo credits for those are in the books. The ones that weren't taken by herders were taken by me or members of our team like Batishik. So that's their anticipated impacts. How do they expect to respond to those kinds of changes? So what are their coping and adaptive responses? Mobility, and we heard about the importance of that, and we'll also really talk about more from Pablo. Storage, so that's both preparing hay and fodder and some other strategies I'll discuss. Increasing animal quality and decreasing quantity. Respecting nature and acting accordingly. So trying to perhaps turn back to some cultural values that some people feel have been lost and act more in accordance to those. And then increasing and strengthening cooperation among herders. So this is just an initial coding of the 120 responses to that open-ended question. So there's much more to do there. I want to step back a minute and just define some of the terms before moving on to talk about responses to a specific kind of climatic disaster or weather disaster that herders deal with. So coping, we're here talking about kind of short-term responses that allow for survival of a given disaster, and adaptation being actions, attitudes, activities, decisions that enable groups and systems to persist over time. But adaptation isn't, it's generally viewed as positive, but you can also have maladaptive responses. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. And more broadly, we've heard, again, from some of the other speakers about the strategies that pastoralists have traditionally used. So Pablo talked eloquently about this. I'll reiterate it a little bit. And then talk about it in the context of this particular system. So diversification, and traditionally that meant a diversity of livestock species, making use of diverse, or as Pablo said, heterogeneous habitats and resources. Mobility, the ability to move around, to access those different resources across the landscape in space and in time. Storage, which can be both storage on the hoof by making sure your animals are fat and well fed and that you have enough of them to hedge in a disaster, but it also is storage of standing biomass for use in dormant or dry seasons or winter in Mongolia, harvesting hay, fodder, things like that. Communal pooling, so the sharing of resources and labor, so both land and other resources. And this picture is an example of herders cooperating, sharing their labor to shear their sheep. And then traditions of exchange and reciprocity. And the classic one in Mongolia that we'll talk about throughout this talk is when a disaster, and I'll define what zud means in a minute, strikes, herders from one community will move to another community and ask permission to access their pastures, or will just access them. And generally those host communities will never deny that access, even if it puts them at risk, knowing that in the next disaster they may have to go back to their neighbors. So those relationships of exchange and reciprocity run, we see it in many forms throughout the culture. A little bit more about mobility. In Mongolia, there's a particular kind of movement that pastoralists make called otar that is different from their normal transient seasonal movements. And it's a often rapid, sometimes long distance movement that's taken by a portion of the herd and the household, either for specific purposes to fatten animals in the summer and fall, often taking them to salt licks or mineral licks, or to avoid or escape a drought or other kind of weather disaster. But now I want to talk a little bit more about one specific kind of weather disaster, natural disaster, that's expected to increase in frequency and intensity with a changing climate, and that is what Mongolians call dzud. And dzud can refer to extreme cold, deep snow, the combination of cold and snow, or really any conditions that render natural forage on which they depend unavailable. So it can also include overgrazing or heavy grazing and trampling that means that there's insufficient forage to support livestock. And dzud conditions generally lead to high morbidity and mortality and have a real impact on herders' livelihoods. This is just a table showing that it does appear that dzud is increasing in frequency. If we break up the past 60 years into 20-year intervals, it seems that dzud and combined dzud and drought events are becoming more common. So these data, and these ones relate to the book that was handed around, are from 4 case studies that we did following the last major dzud, which took place in 2010. And we were really fortunate that we were able to opportunistically go into these communities where we had already been working for a period of time and had data from before this event. And the World Bank supported us to quickly go in immediately afterwards in the spring after that very bad winter and talk to herder communities both in focus groups, interviews, and with a household survey about how they'd been affected, how they coped, and what they were doing in response to that. And as part of that, we also gave herders cameras, and that's what this book is about, and I'll share some of those photos here, and asked them to take photographs in their communities that related to their experience of this disaster. And then we brought the photographers back together after a week or so, printed their photos for them, their images. They wrote captions to their images, and we had group discussions about what these meant and what could be learned from this experience. So the title of that book was really their title. Their title was Dzudni Sorgams, or Lessons of the Dzud. So vulnerability is generally defined as susceptibility to harm, and in the vulnerability literature, it's generally divided into these 3 different components. Exposure to that harm, so in the case of dzud, that would be the temperatures and snow, the things that are actually causing the reduction in forage, or that livestock's inability to access it. Sensitivity, so those are the characteristics of the household or community that's being exposed and their ability to cope with it, and then the actual impacts and responses, which in combination we often refer to as their adaptive capacity. So here I'm going to really just share the herder's words as interpreted in these categories. So that their exposure, Gamhoyat from Ikhtamir took this photograph of the carcasses that spring following the dzud. And his interpretation, the main factors that caused the loss of animals in the dzud were continuous severe cold, heavy snow, livestock migrating in from neighboring regions, a shortage of fodder, and windstorms. So from his perspective, those were the factors that constituted the exposure. Another herder from Jinsung also talked about this phenomenon of the hufdzud, or incoming livestock. So about 20 households with 16,000 animals entered our grazing territory for Otter. The high concentration of animals around wells causes water shortages in winter pasture areas. Therefore, in conditions of really not much snow, migration of animals from neighboring slum caused a so-called hufdzud. So a real combination of factors. In terms of sensitivity, again, Gamhoyak gave the example, instead of giving the example of who didn't survive, he gave the example of an animal that actually came through that disaster in pretty good shape and attributed that to having stored supplies of fodder, being able to access water, and having a lot of good attention from the owner. In terms of those impacts, again, Ganhoyuk took this picture of a few of the remaining livestock of one family in his community. In 2009, before the Dzud, this family had over 100 cattle. Now there are only 20 left. And this has affected them emotionally as well as economically. So it's pretty obvious that these kinds of losses affect people economically and affect their livelihoods, but sometimes we don't pay attention to the psychological and emotional impacts. And Dzud certainly has those, as some of my Mongolian colleagues that are here that can attest, who've gone out during these events and given support to people. And then there's the impact on food security as well. The impact of Dzud can be described in terms of the loss of one bucket and one cooking pot of milk.